views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. Tonight's show is a core program about the Bronx over the last half century. Those who are older instinctively know what it means when we say in the 70s the Bronx was burning. If you're younger, you might have read about it, you might have studied it, you might have heard your parents, grandparents, or neighbors even talk about it. But at long last, and I know they've been working on it, they told me just before, for 10 years, the documentary Decade of Fire that chronicles these difficult and remarkable times in the Bronx is ready to go. It will have its premiere this coming weekend on West 23rd Street, She in Manhattan. But tonight we will give you your first look at part of the film. We'll speak with one of the producers and also to a Bronx community leader who appears in the film and can tell you firsthand what it was like to begin the rebuilding of the devastated Bronx. So please join me in welcoming co-director and producer Gretchen Hildebrand. Nice to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
And the president of Banana Kelly from the late 70s till now, Harry DiRienzo. Nice to have you with us. All right, let's start with you, Ms. Hildebrand, and talk about the film. 10 years in the making. We need to shout out to Vivian Vasquez right off the top, who really was the brainchild behind it. Just tell me about the creation of this film and why it is significant to the Bronx even today.
I really regret that Vivian couldn't be here. You'll see in the footage that she's my co-producer and director, but she's also in the film, and it really is her story in many ways because she grew up on Leggett Avenue in the 1970s. So she really saw all this happen as a kid, and this story is really about her coming to grips with what happened and how to think about it in the Bronx today. And I think there's all kinds of reasons why it's relevant today.
You know, I'm always interested. You're not from the Bronx, she told me before the show.
Unfortunately.
We let her on the show. And I'm always interested. So somebody presents a project like this to you. How do you receive it?
Sure.
What do you think of it? And thank you to Vivian for bringing someone in from the outside because it gives perspective she might not have had from the inside. Tell me, how did the whole concept strike you before you even set about handling it?
Well, I had just moved to New York from LA, and I didn't know very much about New York.
I didn't know the Bronx from Brooklyn.
I really didn't. And so Vivian and a third producer on our film, her name's Julia Steele-Allen, they were working together and putting together a curriculum for Bronx High School. And they wanted to do a curriculum about Bronx history because they really saw young people living with this history and the stigma that they really knew came from this time, but those kids didn't have an idea of where it came from. They didn't even know about the fires. So in that process, Vivian started telling her story to Julia, and Julia was staying at my house, so we all started talking about it, and then they really wanted to share the story beyond, one curriculum or one high school. They really wanted it to be a history that kids all over the Bronx and even just in places like the Bronx all across the country could find out what happened. How did our community become what it is today, and what role do we play in that community?
And as a filmmaker looking presumably for things that would be interesting to do, you probably said, wow, this is an untold story of tens of thousands of people, of a section of the Bronx, section of New York. You must have thought it was amazing.
And I grew up, when this was happening, I was born in '72. So, but I remember I grew up, in Vermont, very far away from the Bronx or New York. But
in every way possible.
In every way possible, but I remember seeing these images, and of course I didn't understand those images when I was a kid. But so hearing Julia and Vivian talk about this history, but also talk about how it wasn't a natural disaster, it didn't come out of nowhere, it was the result of decisions that were made and policies that had effects. Some of them were immediate and some of them took a long time to show themselves, but that this was a disaster that affected millions of people for generations, and it could have been, it didn't have to go that way.
Racism at the bottom of it. I mean, it
Absolutely.
is stated pretty well in the materials of the
Yes.
film, so that decisions were made not caring about certain neighborhoods because of the types of people who are living
Well,
there.
not just that, but the fact that housing policy at its, in its inception from the New Deal and prior to that too, was based on a policy of segregation. And so, how does that affect a community in the 70s? Well, so many things happened in New York since redlining was in effect, which starved the community of resources, since urban renewal tore down low-income communities in Manhattan and forced people to move into the Bronx because there was nowhere else for them to go. I mean, those are all things that had their roots in racism, absolutely.
Harry, the rest of the world found out, I would think, and it's been beyond widely publicized when Howard Cosell looked at an aerial shot at the World Series, I guess it was 1978, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." And then the rest of the world found out of it. When you hear about that, and when you think about that, having been there and lived through it, what do you think of? What does it conjure up in your mind when you say, you finally found out?
Well, there's fires, but there was still no recognition that people lived in the Bronx. And the people who lived there were really...
That it was homes burning. It wasn't just,
It was
buildings
people's
or
homes
warehouses.
that were burning, right. I mean, when I started working in South Bronx, that was 1972. The area was just teeming with people and teeming with culture. I mean, people on the fire escapes, music, the smell of pernil and bustelo and kites flying on the roof and pigeons and a real sense of family. And I don't care how bad things were. And in early 70s, we had crime problems, and I think we're in Fort Apache, where I live, the 41st precinct, had the highest unsolved homicide rate in the country. But if you got back to your block, I don't care what was going on, you were safe, there was family, people were taking care of one another, there was a real sense of community. And that, I kind of fell in love with that, because it was a real wonderful thing to see people in circumstances that from the outside didn't look that great. But multicultural, but taking care of business. The fire started around the mid-70s. And by the time the 80s came, 70% or 80% of our neighborhood was burned out, and the people had left. So what I take away from that is that it's a statement from afar, and with no sense that the people there meant anything.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the fires. I want you to define that. Then we're going to have Gretchen introduce the trailer, and then we'll keep the dialogue, because the trailer... I don't even want to give it words. You'll get it right away. Bronx people will understand it. You made an assumption about that the fires started. This wasn't just that somebody lit a match. This was, frankly, deliberate. Talk about why there were fires, why the buildings and neighborhoods were burnt down.
I started working in a settlement house on Simpson Street in the early 70s. And it wasn't unusual for kids to come in with notes saying, be out by 3 p.m. And what that meant was that their building was going to burn. So where'd the fires come from? Most of the fires came from arson. Because when you have the disinvestment you talked about, that people were crammed into neighborhoods. Not only were they said this is where you had to live, they couldn't live somewhere else because of redlining policies, restrictive covenants, brokerage steering, all that kind of stuff kept people there. And then when you had urban renewal, those areas were redlined as well. So we said to people, Lincoln Center is a better use of this land than San Juan Hill. So let's get these people out of here. And where do they go? They go to other redlined areas, and they become packed into those areas. Landlords took as much profit as they could without the investment coming in. And when they couldn't take any more profit, they took the last bit of profit through arson.
They burned it down.
They burned it down to get the insurance money. Now there were some there was some, social club fires and some electrical fires, but I would say, and this is all anecdotal, 80 to 90% of it was arson. Because you can't have, I moved into Fox Street in 1976. There's no way you can have 3 or 4 alarm fires every single night just from an electrical fire or from 2 people getting pissed off at a social club. This was arson, and this is what burned down the Bronx.
You know what is fascinating about that is, and when you hear that today and somebody said, well, a landlord burnt down a building or destroyed some property to make a profit out of it, it seems incredible that anybody would burn down a building. This was literally burning down sections of neighborhoods that people live in right now, that we know of right now. You say, wait a minute, that's what happened here. So, Gretchen, let's introduce the trailer. You want to
Well,
add
I just
one
wanted
thing?
to add one thing,
Sure.
which is that what we also found, I mean, you're absolutely right, but that fires were also commonplace, and the destruction left behind by fires, it became commonplace because this area, it wasn't just redlined, but it was abandoned by the city.
Abandoned by the city. I did
Yeah.
want to add that
Yeah.
the fire stations were closed. You couldn't even fight the fires. You couldn't
Well,
even say,
and
well,
there
we got a
were,
problem.
and I want to give a shout out to the firefighters. They were fighting fires as much as they could, but the city was cutting back firefighters. They cut their force by like a third during this time.
It's a remarkable period of time.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us any introduction? Oh, here we are, a decade of fire. It's your first look. It's a 4-minute trailer. We're going to play the
Yeah.
whole thing. And then I want to talk about what Harry has done to help rebuild after these things. And then we'll talk about, of course,
Great.
the showing and the premiere and everything else.
Can I just say
more
one thing about
before we
Vivian?
do it? Everybody's got a lot to say.
This film, I mean, there's been a lot of films about the fires in the Bronx, but I don't think we've ever had a film or documentary that's so personal. This is a personal story, and that comes through in the portrayal in the movie.
And again, for me, it means that people of the Bronx today will relate to it because they'll say, wait a minute, these are my
Cousins,
antecedents,
whatever,
right.
whatever.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, a thrill and a pleasure and very important moment in the Bronx to present to you Decade of Fire. So here's a quick look at it.
We grew up in rubble. We grew up with burnt out decay all over us. The South Bronx was burning down around us, and nobody seemed to know why. This is a story of what happened to my neighborhood.
Everything south of the Cross Bronx Expressway, they just let it burn, and nobody gave a damn.
Fear was everywhere, and everybody was just trying to stay quiet about what was happening.
You see streets where it was teeming with people to become a ghost town.
We had come here from the South and from Puerto Rico, searching for the American dream. Our families lived side by side in the most integrated neighborhoods in the country. But after the fires, it would all be gone. How could city government allow this to happen? Who was in charge? Why?
The South Bronx used to be a respectable Jewish neighborhood. It hasn't been bombed, it's been devastated by neglect, and the people who live here, mostly immigrants from the Deep South or Puerto Rico.
But we didn't burn the Bronx. We were the ones who stayed.
We didn't want to leave. We didn't want to go, but we didn't know how. Sometimes you need somebody to just start it.
I said, no, wait a minute. I have to make my move right now.
I made a commitment then, in December 1974, that I was going to put this building back together.
The reason we're trying to do all these things is to show an example to the rest of the people in the neighborhood that if you just try, you could make a lot better neighborhood.
This was just a taste of things to come.
But we need more money, Carter, because I think
the federal government can come in and wave a wand and do this.
Push! Why don't you push?
This story is not just about the Bronx. There are places like this in every major city in America. Places that everyone has given up on, except for us. We came from this so-called terrible place, the South Bronx. But we would never leave it behind.
There you go. Congratulations. And if you are, I assume you're as emotionally moved as I am about seeing that. The one thing I wanted to ask you before the show, but I saved it for the show. So all that footage, now you didn't, people didn't have their cell phones. You could shoot anything at the time.
No.
Where did a lot of that footage come from?
All over the place. You know, you see in the very beginning some kids walking down the street, and that's Vivian as a 2-year-old, and her dad was.
And you see her later on. That is Vivian Vasquez.
Yeah, on the subway and in the car, yeah.
Exactly. So it's her story, and she narrates just like she narrates the trailer. And her dad was shooting home movies throughout her childhood, so that was a treasure trove. And then we were just talking about with Harry how there was a couple of films made about Banana Kelly in like the late 70s and early 80s, and so. Those directors have been very generous in sharing their footage with us.
Well, you know, it's such an important part of history, certainly about our history, because it was so pivotal, and the implications of it went into all different areas. Let's talk about the creation of Banana Kelly as a result and a reaction to what we just saw.
Well, when I was working in a settlement house, I had an after-hours basketball thing where adults, we wouldn't let adults into the settlement house. This is Casita Maria, but the after hours we did. And after we finished, like, you know, playing basketball and stuff, we'd sit around, most of us all in our 20s, all people from the neighborhood, talking about what's going on in this neighborhood and how do we stop it. And so on Kelly Street, there was a family, the Potts family, and particularly Mr. Frank Potts, who was the father of the guys I knew, and this guy, while everyone else was either burning their buildings or running away, this guy was holding on to his block and trying to save the buildings. And we said, well, let's go to Kelly Street and take over some vacant buildings. Some were privately owned, some were city-owned, and let's just try to do this through sweat equity, because as you mentioned earlier, there was no resources. So the problem was that there was no money to do anything. But the good part of it was you could do whatever you wanted. You know, we were squatters. We didn't get arrested. It's like, we don't care about the buildings, we don't care about the people, we don't care about the area. You know, the planned shrinkage was the sort of the theme of the day. But you know, you want to go in that building and start cleaning out? Hey, go ahead, knock yourself out. And so now if you try to do that, you'll get arrested.
Well, of course. So you cleaned it out. I mean, the banana, of course, is the circular shape. And then slowly but surely, literally reclaimed those buildings.
Well, yes, but a number of things converged, though. You know, you plan and you have vision, and people that, you know, there's a group. No one person could do this. We had a group that did this. But a number of things happened.
That's the sequel, too, for the next movie, by the way.
In 1976, the city passed a law to take buildings away from landlords if they didn't pay their taxes, because the city was being charged with phantom bookkeeping. So they said, fine, we're going to get tough on the landlords. Well, the city turned through a fiscal measure, created the second largest public housing system in the country, behind the New York City Housing Authority. So now we have 40,000 units of vacant buildings, right? And the city doesn't know what to do with them. We had that. And so they turned to groups like Banana Kelly and said, we don't
really know what to do with it.
What do we do with it?
Who was the mayor at the time?
That was Koch.
It was Ed Koch.
Because it was Beam when it started, but Koch came in, and luckily Beam's housing administrator, Roger Starr, who coined planned shrinkage, he couldn't stand nonprofit groups. He thought we were all like revolutionary and socialists. He refused to spend $300 million in community block grant funds, federal money. So when Koch came in, all of a sudden he's got 30, 40,000 units, doesn't know what to do with, and he's got $300 million sitting in the bank, and he got these community groups like MBD and Banana Kelly and, in Brooklyn, Los Sudes, other groups like that, they're all over the city. He said, oh, fine, we'll work with the tenants, and for every Banana Kelly, there were probably 20 or 30 buildings where the tenants, mostly women, organized themselves and started collecting their own rents, kicking out the drug dealers, paying for the fuel and things like that to maintain the neighborhood. And what this whole thing is being built on now were the efforts of the groups like Banana Kelly and all those people who just refused to move and said, we're going to take care of things ourselves.
And the state of those built now, Banana Kelly is healthy, relatively healthy, we'd like to think.
I say relatively healthy, you can say that, yes.
And what is the status of those other properties?
Somewhat tenuous, because what happened was, in the intervening years,
give me some streets, or
like Barretto and Jennings and Stebbins, all these
Fox
streets.
Street?
Fox Street. You have people who took care of their buildings, but costs have gone up tremendously since the 70s, and people's incomes have not. So, despite Herculean efforts by a lot of people, a lot of these buildings where people through self-help took them over do struggle.
Let's go back to the film a little bit. There are people I'd like to think who are watching this right now and saying, I'd love to see this thing. This is, and it's an education for me. For some people, it may be memory for them. For others, certainly, I'd like my children to know. I think it's just so important. I talk to so many young people in the Bronx all the time, and they've heard about this. It's fascinating to really learn. So when and where are we going to see it? I'm going to be at the premiere, by the way.
Yeah, it's playing as part of the Doc NYC Film Festival. It's going to be the world premiere, so you'll be seeing it for the first time with everybody else there. It's November 10th, Saturday at 4:30 at the SBA Theater, and I actually don't...
23rd, yes. So it's on our screen right
great.
now. So
Excellent, yeah.
And also we put the a website up there so you can navigate through there and get your tickets and everything.
And if you, unfortunately, it's rush only now. There's very few tickets left. You can come to the theater, see if you can get a ticket. If you can't, we are going to be having many screenings in the Bronx in January and across the city.
Now, the 4:15 or 4:30 showing is the first one. Will there be others or that's just that one?
Well, there's just one in the festival, but come January,
Boy,
we're actually,
I know,
we're going to bring the film to 8 different communities across the city that have been targeted by rezoning by the city, because that's the next front of development and displacement that, especially in the Bronx, there's been enormous community resistance and organizing around. So we're going to connect with those groups.
Talk to me a little bit about you as a director and producer, and if you, I know this from the creative process, you do something that's meaningful, then you change, then you learn, and you develop.
Yeah.
Talk to me about, we talked about how you received the project, but now what I'm really interested in is attitude about what you make of Bronxites after having watched what goes on.
Well,
I'm seeding the clouds for this because I know what I'm going to get. But I want to make that point because I think people in the Bronx need to know who we are. We rarely define this, and to me, this is defining who we are.
Well, what Vivian always says is that, there's so much pride at just having survived, and as you both know, not just surviving, but that people came together and they saved their neighborhoods, when the rest of the world had kind of walked away. So they saved them. You've just seen the footage of what looks like a bombed out shell. People came to that and they're like, we can make this work. There's a character, Ramon Rueda, who also started the People's Development Corporation, and he was like, these are the raw materials. We can make this happen for ourselves because clearly nobody else is going to do it for us. And having the chance to learn this history and meet these incredible people from the Bronx, it's just been an honor.
Harry, let's just review some of the later history. People have heard of Nos Quedamos. Now, this was all later on, right? But you've really defined this culture of people. So when you look at potential for gentrification now in some of those areas, that some of these very people who did this, could end up being displaced or their homes being, kind of changed in ways that they don't control. What are your thoughts? At this point, and is it preventable? Is there a way to deal with it, or is this just the natural development and progression of things?
Well, we're not going to stop development. It's going to happen, right? The city is getting, more and more people coming in, people who wouldn't even look at this, were scared to ride through the Bronx and now looking to reside in the Bronx. But by controlling land and controlling housing, which we do, Banana Kelly has over about 50 buildings right now. And I get calls every day of the week to sell them. We're not selling anything. By maintaining those, by creating community land trusts, and by making sure that there's some resident control over what goes on in our neighborhoods. When people come in, we don't want people coming in and discovering the Bronx and bringing their sensitivity and their vulnerabilities and getting upset when they see people playing music or something like that. There's a Bronx culture, and come on in, but you better accommodate the culture that's already there and not try to supplant it with your own culture or lack thereof.
There was a lot of talk, and there is currently a lot of talk about land trusts in some of the Hunts Point areas. Is that the kind of a thing that you're saying, you know what, this is a good thing, this is going to help us survive some of these issues?
Yeah, control over the land is key. And if we have control, that was the gift we were given in the 70s, right?
Because nobody cared.
Nobody cared.
Take
so,
the land, sure.
Take it, it's all yours.
It's not worth it.
But if we can take something that has value and then ensure that people are included in the development and that they can have affordable housing for as long as we can look forward, then we have a situation where you're building community, because anyone could build a neighborhood. But it takes groups like Banana Kelly and Nostradamus and MBD and all to really build a community.
And I will add, it takes, and I'm very prejudiced in this area, it takes the passion of the people of the Bronx to know what community is,
right.
to understand what family is. It's how you defined it to begin with. Gretchen, I hate to ask this question. Part 2, a sequel? Are we going to go for the next decade through the 80s
the
or
Bronx
90s?
has to be. It should be a mini series.
It
should be a
major series.
I feel like there's so many enormous characters and stories, and really part of what this movie is about is allowing Vivian and people from the Bronx to tell their own stories, and I think that's just getting started. And I really, I hope people are just see this film, maybe they want to investigate, why did the city close firehouses? There's so many things that we touch on in this story. We couldn't go all the way, and so bring it on.
Maybe it will write its own story.
Yeah.
Gretchen Hildebrand, thank you so much.
Thank you
for working on this film, and thank you for bringing it to us today. And Harry, decades and decades of great work in developing the Bronx and staying true to who we are. We really appreciate it.
And kudos to Vivian. This is
kudos to Vivian. Great,
yes.
great
Well,
work.
we'll all be out there Saturday the 10th,
and she'll be there.
We'll give her a big hug. If you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, send us an email at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org. You can send us a tweet at BronxTalk or post them on our Facebook page. We'll read them on the air during a future edition of the program. You can check out our archives at BronxNet.org. BronxTalk you can find by following the watch menu on the new BronxNet website. We thank our producer is Helen Greenberg. Our director is Nick Marrero. We will see you as we do every Monday night next week. Good night. Thank you.